Welcome everyone. Apologies for the very brief delay in the start of the webinar. We're gonna jump in very quickly. Whilst everybody is streaming in, let me first of all welcome our panelists, the distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, esteemed panelists, Dr. Jason Haynes, Mr. Matthew Wilson, Mr. James Elsmore, colleagues, friends, those joining us from the region and from around the world, good day to you. My name is Dr. Remy, Director of the Shridath Ramphal Center here at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. Together with the SRC's Miss Alicia Nichols, Trade Fellow at the SRC, let me warmly welcome each and every one of you to this webinar entitled Facilitating Private Sector Investment for SDG Achievement in Caribbean Small Island Developing States, or SIDS. This webinar is one of the direct outputs of the SRC policy brief that was authored by Ms. Alicia Nichols on investment facilitation and financing of the SDGs. The first output being an SRC one-on-one chat with Mr. Deodat Maharaj, Executive Director of the Caribbean Export Development Agency, on the private sector in the Caribbean as a development actor. That interview is also available on our website, shridathramfalcenter.com. Today's event is a product of a strategic decision taken by the SRC earlier this year to bring the UN Sustainable Development Goals and their intersection with trade and investment directly to decision-making corridors of the Caribbean region by forcing policymakers, businesses, and citizens to confront the challenges and opportunities through the SRC's thought leadership, training, and advocacy on these issues. If you peruse our website under the Trade and SDG tab, you will see that we have already begun that mission through webinars on trade and natural disasters, policy briefs with an SDG focus. So in addition to the one I mentioned above, authored by Ms. Alicia Nichols, we've also recently produced a Food for Thought series featuring a policy brief authored by Ms. Chelsea Brathwaite on trade and food security, which will be the subject of another webinar and more programming later on this year. Look out also for more of these policy briefs examining the intersection between trade and climate change, as well as other short courses, including trade and the blue economy, trade and climate change, trade and natural disasters, customs businesses, women and trade, which we will sprinkle throughout the remainder of the year. Now, today's discussion, some might say, is the most important on the SDGs and maybe has been overlooked by some of our Caribbean policymakers. At the end of the day, the central question we need to be able to answer is, how are we going to finance this global movement to achieve SDGs by 2030? Even before COVID-19, rich countries have promised to assist us with financing through grants and loans, concessional financing. And now with COVID, the case for financing a $500 billion per year deficit for achieving the SDGs is even more critical. Yes, we will need governments to create the enabling environment conducive to achieving these goals. But what has become patently clear to me, at least, is that the new sources of finances are also urgently required. And today's discussion will begin that very important debate, thinking creatively about how the Caribbean private sector can assist in achieving the SDGs. For your pleasure and information, we have drawn together this morning some of the top minds in the world and the region, most of whom will be introduced by today's moderator, Ms. Nichols, after our keynote speaker. But permit me to first introduce that keynote speaker, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the world's leading development economist and more importantly, in my mind, the leading moral force and conscience fighting in the trenches on behalf of the developing world in calling the world's rich to live up to their promises and create a rights-based approach to achieving the SDGs. In addition to the SDGs, his voice challenges all to build effective strategies to address complex challenges like debt crises, hyperinflations, the transition from central planning to market economies, the control of AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, the escape from extreme poverty, and the battle against human-induced climate change. Professor Sachs serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he holds the rank of university professor, the university's highest academic rank. Professor Sachs held the position of director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University from 2002 to 2016. He is president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development, and an SDG advocate for UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. From 2001 to 2018, Professor Sachs served as special advisor to the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and now our present Secretary General of the UN. Thank you so much, Professor Sachs, for being here with us. I now hand over the floor to you to deliver your keynote remarks, after which our moderator will introduce our other distinguished panelists for today's discussion. Over to you, Professor. Thanks, and thank you again for being here with us.
Well, thank you for that wonderfully warm introduction, and it's so good to be with you and with all of the colleagues. We had such a fantastic visit to Barbados just a couple of weeks ago. I completely adore your Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, who's one of the great world leaders, really such an important, fantastic, clear-thinking voice, and we need her voice. She's chairing the Development Committee for the World Bank, as you know, and this is the time when we need to put forward the proposition that achieving the SDGs is not a choice. It is the commitment, it is the necessity for a decent world, and we absolutely need to do all of the groundwork to make it happen. And that wasn't happening even before COVID. And then COVID came and threw us way off course. You set the issue up completely right, how to finance the SDGs, because basically sustainable development at this moment is a financial issue. It's an investment issue, I should say. We have to invest in our societies to make more sustainable and inclusive societies. And that investment comes in a number of different ways. Most importantly is investing in our children, investing in the people. So the most important investments we can make in society is education, which is under threat because of COVID, of course, and healthcare, nutrition. In other words, the basics to enable each individual and especially each of our children in society to achieve their physical, their cognitive, their personal potential. That's an investment. We call it investment in human capital, of course. Then there are investments in infrastructure, which are of paramount importance. We have to reinvest in our energy infrastructure. I think everybody understands or should understand that within a period of less than 30 years, we need to convert what was a 100-year in the making fossil fuel-based infrastructure into a decarbonized energy system. Just minutes ago, President Biden, as an example, unveiled, I didn't watch it, but I just saw the banner coming across my screen, unveiled a plan with the American automotive industry. So it's a public-private plan to ensure that at least 50% of all light-duty vehicles sold as of 2030 are electric vehicles. I think it can be even higher by 2035, I would say no more sales of emitting vehicles. Well, that means a lot of investment. It means a lot of investment for being able to produce those zero emission vehicles. It means a lot of investment to be able to use those zero emission vehicles. So in the Caribbean, the vehicles are in the future going to be electric. That means a lot of charging stations. That means a power grid that is up to the challenge. And that's actually a very big challenge. We know from our experience in the last 2 years, and it was happening anyway, universal access to quality digital services is now a core part of any infrastructure of sustainable development. We need to make sure that everybody has access to online services, whether it's government transfer payments, or being able to pay taxes online, or do banking online, or manage a business now, which cannot be done other than online, or perhaps to have children's education lessons partly online. Certainly healthcare will be substantially online in the future. Doctors' appointments, consultations, monitoring of symptoms, and so forth. And that requires investment. So you really pointed to the central issue. How is all of this going to be paid for? And of course, there's the business investment, private business that will be creating the jobs of the future as well. So all of this finance challenge, now I have to tell you, unfortunately, is unsolved, and we don't have the serious thinking that we need to solve it at the moment. But with the Prime Minister Mia Mottley's voice and your voice and our work together, we're going to get this onto the front of the agenda in the coming year. You mentioned a $500 billion gap in SDG financing. That number comes from, among other places, a recent set of IMF studies, which ask a basic question. Suppose that governments do what they're supposed to do. They invest in healthcare, they invest in education, they invest in roads, safe water, sanitation, green energy, digital. Do they have the resources to do this? And the IMF says, well, they could mobilize more domestic revenues through taxation and so forth. So let's count something for that. Let's count what they currently collect. Let's count what can be saved by efficiencies and better management. And then the IMF says, after all of those adjustments, there still is a $500 billion a year shortfall in financing for the 57 countries that are in the category of the low-income developing countries, LIDCs, which the IMF uses to designate countries eligible for some kind of concessional finance. It's about 1.8 billion people. So there's a financing gap of $500 billion. Now, the IMF doesn't answer the question how to close that financing gap. That's what we need to really put on the table. But the IMF straightforwardly says that gap is real, because typically in the past, poor countries would be told, well, do this, do that, without saying how, or is it feasible? At least the IMF has been clear it's not feasible from within the countries themselves under the current arrangements. So how will we create the space for these investments? And starting point is it's feasible, because $500 billion, while not a small amount for you and me, is not so big compared to the world economy, which runs at about $100 trillion a year. So we're talking about something like 0.5% of GDP. Let me give you another metric. The IMF showed last week in its mid-year World Economic Outlook assessment that the rich countries have mobilized since the start of COVID about $17 trillion of emergency finance, 17 trillion. So compare that with the 500 billion SDG gap, which is 34 times larger, by the way. They showed that the emerging economies mobilized only about 3.5 trillion, and their low income developing countries mobilized under $2 trillion. So what they showed was the rich countries have plenty of access to finance. Hey, but what about the rest of us? What's going on with countries that lack the fiber connectivity, that need the health systems, that urgently need the investments in green energy and so on? And for the Caribbean, let's face it, it's even a bigger challenge in a per capita basis, because on top of everything else, the Caribbean has a massive headache, which is that the storms are getting stronger, the sea level is rising, the climate change impacts are hurting, and not any of this came from anything that countries in the Caribbean did. This is all rich country responsibility. And they don't even know they have the responsibility because they're such irresponsible laggards. They don't say, oh my God, what did we do? How can we help? It doesn't even dawn on them to ask that question, unfortunately, in the United States. And we still have our share of reality denying politicians, by the way. That's no secret after we've had a Trump administration, but we still have Governor Abbott of Texas, whose whole grid failed, who suffering massive climate change, and that dunderhead can't even figure out that climate change is real. Or we have DeSantis in nearby you in Florida. Take him, although I don't wish him on the Caribbean. But what unbelievable nonsense is going on in that state? So here's our problem, which is massive needs, an unfair burden that has come from the rich countries imposing losses and damages on the poor countries, and so far, no good answer. And that's where, sorry, I can't give you the punchline of the full answer, but what I can say is this is where we need to put the focus in the coming year urgently, which is to say, it's obvious there's enough finance in the world. The US interest rates for a 30-year loan are 1.1% right now. Now, if Caribbean countries could borrow 30 years at 1.1%, we wouldn't be having this conversation. These investments would be made. This would be a phenomenal investment, because by building the infrastructure, there would be all the opportunities for building new sectors, new industry, new jobs in the future. But the Caribbean countries can't borrow at 1.1%. Some of them can't borrow at all. And if they go to the capital markets, they're going to pay 5 or 10% interest rates, coupon rates, which is completely out of the means of fiscal sustainability. And so the name of the game is that the rich countries absolutely have to facilitate low-cost, long-term finance to the rest of the world. And my thought about this is that a way to do this would be a massive upscaling of financing through the multilateral development banks. So it could be the Caribbean Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Andean Development Fund, the CAF, the World Bank, the African Development Bank. I just joined this discussion from a moment ago, a discussion with the Islamic Development Bank, which covers 1.9 billion people, and so forth. We need, through the development banks, which, if they have enough paid in capital from the rich countries, have a massive ability on their balance sheets to borrow at low cost and lend long-term, low interest for building infrastructure, building human capital, making these investments, building a green economy. In addition, we need special funding for losses and damages, because why should the Caribbean pay this phenomenal cost of adaptation when it is the responsibility of the United States, Europe, and the other high emitting countries. So my idea, what I'm pressing every day inside the UN and internationally, is that we create in the coming months a new development finance framework that looks honestly at what's happened with COVID, that looks honestly at the SDG needs, that looks honestly at the climate change agenda, both the mitigation side and the adaptation and losses and damages side, and that we view our situation in the world today akin to the situation in 1944-45, when the Bretton Woods institutions were created, because the world leaders knew we need something new for the future of finance, because that's what we need today. We need a financial system that doesn't direct all the money to the rich countries, but that enables a massive investment program for development in the rest of the world and does it on a fair and inclusive and equitable basis. So I am calling specifically for two immediate things. One is a massive scale up on the balance sheets of the multilateral development banks. Second is special funding for countries in vulnerability, like the Caribbean region, because of climate change, that reflects the historical responsibilities of the world to provide that. These two things. And what I'm hoping is that we can really rev up this discussion and reach some serious new policies and politics, at least by the time of the G20 summit in Bali in 2022. Indonesia will be president of the G20 next year. That is a good forum for us because it is a forum in which the voices of the developing world are represented and will be leading this effort. It's good for the Caribbean that it's going to be in an archipelago country next year, one that understands islands. They even have more islands than you do, 17,000 islands in the Indonesian archipelago. So they know how threatening climate change is. And I think we can make some special advances there. So I'm looking forward to a good period of intensive work together. I think we'll make progress. By the way, just a glimmer of hope. We got the SDR allocation this month. This is $650 billion. President Biden came through, the US Treasury came through. I know how hard the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen worked on this, and it's a real advance. And I think we can build on that advance so that next year we can have a real breakthrough of a new era of development finance that's seriously aligned with the needs of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. Let me stop there. Let me thank you very much. And let me apologize that I have to run to a 10:30 Zoom, so I'm gonna have to get off, but you'll fill me in on the results of the panel discussion.
Absolutely, Professor. Let me just, in the remaining 30 seconds, thank you. It's so wonderful to know that we have an ally in you. I think the trip to the Caribbean and Barbados in particular warmed your heart, literally as well as figuratively. Take on as one of your two priorities the issue of vulnerabilities. It's something we've been fighting, our leaders have been fighting, but to hear it through your voice and to know that it's going to be part of your advocacy gives me a lot of hope. And I thank you for making the time to speak with us. I know you have to run off, but I will be in touch. And anything SRC or we can do to promote any of your messaging, either through the CDB or any of these other entities that you have mentioned, we will take on that task. So
we're going to do it together. Thank you so much, everybody. Great to see you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks also to Savannah, who I know assisted in getting us Savannah Pearson, getting us to have that 30 minutes time with Professor Sachs. So this brings to the end the first segment of our webinar. Please stay tuned for the second half. I'm going to pass on to my very worthy colleague, Miss Alicia Nichols, expert in this area, to introduce our expert panelists and take the discussion further and bring it home to the Caribbean. Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Remy, and thank you everyone for joining us. It is not an enviable position to come after Professor Sachs, but thankfully it is not me you're here to listen to, but my esteemed panelists who I will introduce shortly. Professor Sachs provided us with an excellent overview of the landscape with regard to the SDGs and the huge financing challenge facing not just developing countries, but the Caribbean in particular. And it sets the scene for today's panel discussion on facilitating private sector investment for SDG achievement in Caribbean SIDS. And I'm happy to see that we have a wide cross-section of audience here. So this is an open discussion. So we do look forward to you sharing your views with us, putting your questions, your comments, etc. in the Q&A section. Before I turn over to my esteemed panelists, let me just note that most Caribbean countries except Guyana, as we know, experienced in some cases double-digit GDP contractions last year due to COVID-19. And that's not even to add in other extraneous events like hurricanes and volcanic eruptions. So in a post-COVID-19 environment like this, where we have all these challenges, where both businesses and governments in the Caribbean are struggling, how can we build these partnerships in a mutually beneficial and sustainable way to set our economies on a sustainable post-pandemic growth path? How does the private sector see its role with regard to the SDG achievement? And how can governments create better enabling environments, not just for foreign direct investment, but increase investment by our domestic private sectors? Do our legal frameworks, like the incentives that we provide, our investment policies where they exist, bilateral investment treaties, and our court systems, do they really create that facilitative environment for private sector investment to be scaled up? And what is the role of the diaspora in all of this? To consider these issues, I'm pleased to introduce today's esteemed panelists. Dr. Jason Haynes serves as lecturer in international investment law and deputy dean, graduate studies and research at the Faculty of Law, UWI-Phil, and is an expert in investment law, among other things. Mr. Matthew Wilson is currently the Chief of Special Projects at the International Trade Center, the Joint Development Agency of the WTO and the UN, and is the only international development agency whose specific mandate is on SMEs. And his work focuses a lot on building partnerships, resource mobilization, outreach. And I must also note, he is a loyal friend of the SRC and an SRC board member. Mr. James Ellsmore is an award-winning serial entrepreneur and writer. He is the CEO of Island Innovation and the co-founder and director of Solar Head of State. He brings a private sector perspective, having worked in several SIDS across the world. All well-known panelists with a vast array of knowledge that we look forward to tapping into over the next hour. And as I noted, please feel free, this is an open discussion, to share your questions for the panelists in the Q&A. So my first question to the panel goes to Mr. Wilson. So as I noted, the ITC is the only international development agency that is fully dedicated to supporting the internationalization of SMEs. From your vantage point, what role can you see the private sector, especially SMEs, playing in SDG achievement and financing?
Thank you very much, Alicia, and a warm hello to everyone. Thank you for having ITC here. But first of all, a congrats to my dear friend Janive on her appointment as director of the center. The center is in very good hands. And I also want to first say that I am in slight awe of Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Like many of us, I watched without taking a breath his recent passionate and on-point assessment at the UN Food System Summit last week. He is an agitator, but an agitator with morality, with facts, and with numbers behind him. And that is a very powerful combination. Okay, my fanboy session is over. Let me turn to the question you asked me. This is a very challenging question, but there's some truisms that I first want to put on the table. The first one, the SDGs remain the global compass to push for sustainable and inclusive growth. And we are in the final decade of delivery of the SDGs. But as Professor Sachs said, meeting the targets is now more in doubt than ever before. And we know the reasons why: COVID, multiple and varied crises hitting us all at the same time, changes in prioritizing and incorporating SDGs, international development programming, ODA programming, and a real lack of SDG consideration in the decision-making and investment choices of the private sector. But we also know the SDGs will not be achieved without the private sector and without investment based on partnership and a dual recognition of economic gains and social gains. But UNCTAD, which is a sister agency to ITC, their research tells us that between 2015 and 2019, the project finance in developing countries in some SDG sectors like power, infrastructure, and telecommunication was actually down 32% from the pre-SDG period, which means we're not necessarily going in the right direction. Now, what are the 4 roles I see the private sector playing when it comes to SDG achievement and financing? The first one is I see the private sector as a financier and as an investor. And this is both through the ordinary business line of the private sector for profit, also through their corporate social responsibility or their foundation arms, because I do believe that we can certainly do good and we can make money at the same time. The key is whether private sector investors will be in it for the medium or the long haul, because transformative results do not happen overnight, especially in SIDS in the Caribbean. So to investors listening, to the private sector listening, make your commitment, but don't expect immediate returns in year 1 or year 2. 2, the private sector as a market and as a buyer. The value chains of large private companies are as long as they are deep. And sometimes that depth can lead to murkiness. We know the problems in these value chains: human rights issues, child labor issues, environmental disasters. But millions of SMEs in developing countries are surviving because they're part of the supply chains to large companies. There's much more that can be done here. From companies developing procurement activities that mandate they buy from women-owned SMEs, or from refugee communities, or from youth entrepreneurs, or for small producers and SIDS, and couple the buying with investing in helping those small producers and service suppliers to become resource efficient and greener, to become leaner and cleaner, to meet public and private sustainability standards, to adhere to ILO standards. This can all be part of the actions of the business community to be a market for SMEs. And third, as a partner and an agitator. I love that word, agitator. Huh? There are a lot of private companies, especially the large ones, who can do better, especially in the Caribbean. And I hope some are listening because I'm going to call names later. But there's some that are doing some solid work. So for example, at ITC, we're working with UPS on women's economic empowerment. We're working with DHL, we're working with eBay, we're working with Facebook and Zoom. So these companies who are doing this kind of work already prioritizing SDGs, they need to inspire others. They need to share their models about what works, and also to truly and respectfully partner with developing countries and with UN agencies like ITC or UN Women or UN Global Compact to ensure a win-win-win outcome. And 4, this is the last one, the business community as an example. So for me, the large private sector and the SMEs should consider more forcefully incorporating the SDGs into their business plans, into their targets, and into their investment decisions. So private sector, use the SDGs to give yourselves credit and serve as a form of scorecard to guide your activities. Increasingly, consumers are looking at how their goods are produced, where the goods are produced, and what is the corporate social responsibility of the producers. So from greening your buildings and processes, ensuring better gender balance in the boardroom, to investing in community education and supporting innovation within your supply chains, these are all things that the private sector can do, including in the Caribbean. And report on these things, share your successes and acknowledge your shortfalls. And the UN has tools that can help businesses incorporate and report on SDG contributions. In 2019, for example, UNCTAD, our sister agency, published the Guidance on Core Indicators as a framework for corporate reporting on contributions towards the attainment of the SDGs. So it's possible. So these are just 4 areas I see the private sector having a role to play in pushing the implementation of the SDGs. Thanks, Alicia.
And thank you, Matthew, for those very concrete suggestions. I'm going to go to James shortly, but just to note that we're getting some really interesting comments and questions in the chat so far. Very important stuff. So I'll be posing those questions to the panelists shortly. But turning over to James, so we heard Matthew's perspective, having come from ITC, which does a lot of work globally with SMEs in particular. So James, as someone who's in the private sector, who works a lot with SIDS across the world, what role do you see as someone in the private sector? What role do you see for you playing in SDG achievement and financing?
Thank you so much, Alicia, for the introduction, and really happy to be here for this interesting discussion. Lots of interesting chats coming in through the comment box as well, which is good to see. So hello to everyone watching. I think the way that I see this, I mean, yes, I'm in the private sector, but we at Island Innovation, we really exist kind of between, as a communicating point between the private sector, the public sector, universities, and kind of intergovernmental systems, etc. There are all these different components, and NGOs, of course, I shouldn't forget. 3, 4, 5 different groupings, depending on how you put them together. And one of the things that I really see trying to work between these different groups is often it feels like people are talking completely different languages. They're approaching these problems from completely different perspectives. And so often I see these kind of exciting initiatives that are really, have a lot of thought put into them, coming from, say, large government or international institutions, but then they don't always resonate with the private sector and kind of the realities of those companies. I think it was in the chat, I saw that Ralph Burkhoff mentioned the timing. Often there can be these 1 to 2 year long processes to access funds or access support that are just not feasible for a private sector company. And so that's one of the really kind of important barriers or areas of separation that I see between these different sectors. And so I think that there is an important role for the private sector, of course, but what does that really mean? I mean, there are companies working in areas like agriculture and renewable energy in the Caribbean, and those projects are only going to really happen on a large scale if implemented through the private sector. But for most SIDS countries, government plays a really huge role. And I guess there's this general rule of the smaller the country, the bigger percentage that government is of the economy in general, which is really important to keep in mind. So clearly, financing from governments alone is not going to achieve the SDGs. But where do companies fit into this? And so a lot of the discussion that I've seen globally from the private sector has been from the big multinational companies. And I do have concerns about that. You know, who is measuring this? Who is monitoring this? What does it really mean often? And so even when we talk about the private sector, we have to break that down. For many of the big multinational companies, in my opinion, it's often greenwashing. It's often an approach of saying, here's all the things that we can do. But then there are other companies that really are putting it at the center of all of their policies. I mean, to give you one example of why I think this is tricky, there are airlines that have committed to integrating the SDGs into their business structure. Now, what does that really mean when one of the SDGs is climate action? That's clearly a matter of perspective. I'm not sure. I'm raising this as a question because I honestly don't know. Can airlines really, with a fossil fuel-based business model, have a approach that is committed to the SDGs? And I guess that comes down to an issue with the SDGs of that there are 17 of them, and so it's very easy for not just companies but any institution to pick or choose the one or two that fit their model and that work for them, and kind of disregard the ones that don't fit for them. And so whenever we involve the private sector, I think we have to think, like, how can we do that in a way that is responsible, that really is not just companies saying, yes, we can meet them without any measuring or monitoring of what those commitments really mean. We all support the SDGs, of course, but just supporting them without tracking what that means isn't enough, in my opinion.
Thank you so much, James. And those are some really important points that you raised in terms of monitoring, like also who is the private sector, because many of our companies, even the large companies here in the Caribbean and in many SIDS, would be considered SMEs. So so I'm going over to Jason. Jason, your question is really timely because a lot of the, I don't know if you're seeing the comments, a lot of the comments are really with regard to the legal structures. So to your mind, you know, what are some of the things that you think we could do better in terms of our legal structures for facilitating investment, private sector investment?
Thank you very much, Alicia, for that very warm introduction and for the question as well. I think it's a really timely question because it's the question that is on every investor's mind, it's on government's mind, and of course, in the context of our academic research in the Faculty of Law, and of course at the Shridath Ramphal Center, it is also on our minds. What can we do better? Well, a whole host of things. Many of our jurisdictions do not have national investment laws that speak to processes with respect to attracting and retaining foreign direct investments. With the exception of Antigua, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana, all of the other Caribbean countries in general don't have the requisite national investment framework in place so as to ensure that investors know at the very outset what they're expecting in the particular jurisdiction. What benefits should they expect? What types of treatment should they expect? And so in my experience, certainly, I have found that to be a significant impediment insofar as attracting private sector investment in our region. I did some work for a hotel company a couple years ago that was interested in coming to one of our Caribbean jurisdictions. And the very fact of having to pay a number of lawyers to consult on various areas of the law because our laws were not in one particular location was a significant impediment to this particular investor wishing to participate in this process of contributing to our sustainable development goals in the realm of private sector development. We don't generally have bilateral investment treaties. There are about 55 bilateral investment treaties in Caribbean, which are currently in force. Most jurisdictions have about 2, with the exception of perhaps Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, who have a few more. Now, the empirical evidence around that question as to whether or not there's a direct correlation between international investment agreements, such as bilateral investment treaties, and private sector investment is quite sparse. But nonetheless, there's some evidence to suggest that investors necessarily look for stability, and having a bilateral investment agreement in place gives the impression that the state is serious about attracting investment and that it is serious about ensuring that investors are treated fairly. And of course, because we don't have many bilateral investment treaties, that of course may dissuade investors, although of course the evidence with respect to this is very limited. But I think practically as well, while of course we have in the region investment promotion agencies, we have investment policies as well, certainly in the context of Jamaica. What we've seen is that in practice, the operationalization of these has been very constrained. The manual nature of these particular processes, ranging from incorporation. Of course, COVID-19 has changed the dynamics somewhat in the sense that companies can now incorporate more effectively. It is a positive development, but certainly I think in general, the failure to have effective electronic processes is a major impediment. Let's talk also about the constant backlog in our court system. The fact that to enforce contracts, you'd have to wait 2 to 3 years in order to be able to do so in an effective manner. Of course, it has been pointed out repeatedly as an issue in the context of the World Bank Doing Business report. In fact, going back to that report, in 2020, the highest ranked Caribbean island in the context of doing business, the ease of doing business, was Jamaica at 71. And most of the region's states are actually in the hundreds. So it really does suggest that insofar as the parameters are concerned for doing business in the region, we're lagging behind. So for example, the ease at which companies can incorporate in our jurisdictions is a challenge. In addition to that, we have the challenge of protection of minority shareholders in the context of insolvency laws, which are generally weak. We also have the challenges associated with enforcing contracts and the length of time that it actually takes to enforce these contracts. Now, the region is moving in the direction of alternative dispute resolution, and in particular, mediation and arbitration. Barbados has set up an arbitration center, the Arbitration Mediation Court of the Caribbean. Jamaica has set one up, so has the BVI, and I believe Trinidad and Tobago, but they're not ubiquitous across the region. And so in terms of settling disputes, it still is a fundamental challenge outside of the courtroom context, because many of our regions and states don't have sort of model or United Nations compliant international commercial arbitration acts. All right. And then, of course, the practical challenges regarding requests for information. There's a culture, I call it, of silence. So you request particular data and information regarding the prospect of investing in a jurisdiction. You don't hear back until 2 weeks later, a month later, even in fact, several months later. If we are serious about generating foreign direct investment, we cannot operate in the manner in which we have in the past, I'd say. And so I'd say that while we have made considerable progress over the last several years in improving our investment climate, we still have a very long way to go to ensure that the private sector feels comfortable investing in our jurisdictions.
Thank you so much, Jason. You raised so many, like Matthew and James, you raised so many important points there. And they are actually in consonance with a lot of the stuff that we see, we hear dealing with investors. And we also see in the chat about the difficulties in doing business in the region, the need for more information. I mean, I'm an academic, you're an academic, you know how hard it is for us to get information, sometimes to do this sort of research, this sort of empirical research that is needed in these areas. I see a hand up, Miss Elsa Alfred. Would you like to make an intervention? Okay, so on to our next question. So there have been some suggestions here about the length of time that it takes to make, to get information, the length of time, the fact that a lot of the laws, and, you know, as we know, it's very difficult for some of our jurisdictions for us to find the laws online, especially the most up-to-date versions. Is it a capacity problem? Is it a culture problem? You know, what is it that needs to be done? Because one of the things we want to discuss here is also solutions to the extent that we can. So we know, many of us know a lot of what the problems are, right? Which is important to acknowledge. But in terms of the solutions, what are some of the things that needs to be done in order to rectify some of these issues? Throwing out to anyone.
So Alicia, I don't have a solution to that long-standing problem. But I will say that it seems that when, and I'm going to take Barbados as an example now. Now, I know how difficult things have been in the past on trade facilitation issues. Barbados has signed on to the trade facilitation WTO agreement, and certain things are being put in place now to have things online, which I think really, really helps. This also helps to deal with issues of corruption, which a colleague in the chat had raised, because sometimes when you put things online, it's just a little bit more more transparent and more tractable and more easy to monitor. Right now, I know we're engaged in the investment facilitation negotiations at the WTO, which I think the whole aim of that is to bring greater transparency and consistency to your investment facilitation regime. But I will tell you something. I mean, so I'm obviously from Barbados, and I'm obviously very interested in getting back to Barbados on vacation. So I pay very, very close attention to all of the COVID-related information. Now, I think Barbados is doing excellent in terms of providing information to travelers outside of Barbados as to what the requirements are, what the processes are, where to access the information. So I don't think it's a capacity issue, because clearly with COVID, when we realized that we need to find a way to get the tourists to either come into Barbados or remain interested in Barbados, or to make it as easy as possible for them to get in a difficult situation, all of a sudden we were able to put all of this information online with beautiful infographics, very easy to find, very easy to read. So it's not a capacity issue. There is something that is missing in the Caribbean between either it's political will or it is the private sector being really fully engaged and really lobbying the government to do these things. There's something missing. There's a missing middle there that I don't quite know what it is, but I do not think it is capacity. But we do have a huge problem in the Caribbean in terms of lack of information, in terms of lack of data, in terms of lack of information on trends, and this is something that I think we really need to address. So that's not really a solution, but that is me saying I don't think it's a capacity issue. I think it is a motivation issue. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And Jason, James, what are you guys' thoughts?
I mean, I do think that in some ways, Matthew is correct. I don't think it is a capacity issue. Certainly, many of the people who work at our investment promotion agencies and in other government agencies have the requisite qualifications. Many of them have gone to school and have had extensive experience either working abroad or working within our jurisdictions. I think the challenge is cultural. I think that unless Caribbean people are passionate about something, unless they see worth and value in something, they're not going to expend the necessary energies around that particular matter. So it may very well be that there needs to be a culture change. And we talk about culture and organizational culture and how that's really important for success, or for the success of an organization. And I really do think that if it is that culture change starts at the political level, so that political will that we've often spoken about, then perhaps that can trickle down to those institutions that are concerned with investment promotion and facilitation. So I'd very much say, Alicia, that going forward, I think there needs to be a serious conversation with those stakeholders who are working in the field regarding how serious they treat with foreign investment, what foreign investment means for us in terms of our balance of payment equilibrium, and how, of course, we can improve our treatment of foreign direct investors. So I think really and truly it's a cultural issue more than anything else from my experience to date.
Thank you so much, Jason. And so, James, I was just wondering, do you think the lack of information, the fact that it's so difficult in many cases sometimes to get the answers to the questions, sometimes, is it a case that is a capacity problem? Is it a cultural problem? Is it something that you see in other regions as well? Feel free to share your insights with us.
Absolutely. I do think the information issue is a huge barrier. I mean, I have a friend who's been doing her PhD on trying to find information about renewables across the Caribbean and has spent years really trying to gather that information. And the issue that I always have is by the time you get that information, it's already out of date. You know, looking at renewable energy sector specifically, and maybe you'll find it for Jamaica and Trinidad, but good luck finding it for the Eastern Caribbean and many of the smaller countries. And I presume that applies across most sectors. Information, if it's available, is out of date. And I don't necessarily know if that's an easy thing to come across. It's a factor of being a smaller country that the information is not available and there just aren't the same resources available for monitoring and collecting all of that. When it comes to capacity, I guess we need to maybe think about that, because I agree that there are plenty of very well qualified people to deal with all of these issues. So it's not a lack of capacity in the sense of training, it's that those people are doing a job that maybe will be done by a whole team in another, again, a larger country. So I do think the scale element is fundamental, and looking at SIDS countries in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, it's a similar issue. There's a scale factor, and it's not uncommon if you look at government to see a ministerial title that is several sentences long by the time you include all of those different elements in there. So I do think it's I think it's a hard one to get by. I mean, it's important that regional universities, I think, play a big role in this. UE and other universities can really help to help gather that information and make it available. But I think there has to be, maybe it's resigning to it, but I think there has to be thought on using that, taking an approach that is kind of despite that lack of information. Sorry, we seem to be moving around on the screen. I got a little bit thrown there, but back to you.
That's okay. And I think based on the chat, and I apologize to our participants, there's a lot of information coming through. So I'm trying to consolidate your comments and questions as much as possible. I'm just going to read one of the comments, and then I'm going to go to a question posed by Dr. Tymon Stewart, who's one of our foremost experts on competition law in the region. But before I do that, I'll go to one of the comments that's in the Q&A, and it says, and it basically is in consonance with some of the things we're saying, if there exists a consensus throughout the region on the importance of FDI to diversify economies, why is it that respective governments are not doing enough to invest in their IPA? So there does seem to be some question about the level of investment by governments into the, and for those who are not familiar, the investment promotion agencies, to allow them to be more effective. So the question from Dr. Stewart is to James. Would collaboration by rivals in the private sector to jointly adopt environmentally sustainable technology be a realistic solution, sharing the higher costs rather than a loaner taking the high costs on his own? And could this be justified as not a cartel, that is, in the public good?
Well, good luck getting competitors to work together. No, I think it would just depend on the sector, and there are obviously sectors where this does happen. I mean, look at all of the hotel and tourism associations around the region where there is collaboration within a sector. So I think it very much varies according to the type of industry. There is, I think, an interesting. Well, when it comes to the private sector, maybe call me pessimistic, but nothing's going to happen unless there's a financial incentive to do so. That's most private companies, that is there. And that financial incentive may be in the form of the branding and marketing that exists from taking on green projects, or it may be more direct through other financial savings. But I think we have to be realistic. And there are two ways that you can make that financial incentive. It's either through, well, what you might say colloquially, a stick or a carrot. Are you facilitating it, or are you enforcing it? And I think there are both. It's giving incentives for companies to adopt good practice that help to meet things. But this is where I do think there is a really important role for governments within countries. I would love to see a more regional approach to this. Again, there's a challenge there. We look at the kind of race to the bottom that you have in the cruise industry. I think there is a general agreement that if there was some level of regional collaboration, that the cruise industry could be better regulated. But what ultimately happens is there's a race to the bottom as either deregulation or cut costs, which at the end of the day benefits the cruise companies the most. And that's probably the most the industry that stands out most in that sense. So I think that what I'm saying is actually, I think where the benefits could be met would be through greater action at the CARICOM level or other regional bodies that actually helps countries have similar laws in place that will allow for greater cooperation. And that can be beneficial on multiple levels. Also, when talking about foreign direct investments, one of the biggest barriers is the cost of market entry. So if a company is looking to go into St. Lucia, but could go into Mexico and has to pay a similar amount in upfront costs of investing in lawyers and all the other things, then they're probably going to look at Mexico or Colombia or a much larger market. And that's obviously things that have happened. I think OECS has done some good work in that, CARICOM also, but perhaps we don't want to go down the regional integration conversation too much, but I do think it's an important part of the puzzle.
No, that's an excellent
Alicia, I want to pick up on this because this is so critical.
Feel free.
This issue of one economic space, and as long as I've been working in the region or for the region, it's been this issue of how do we make ourselves truly one economic space? How do we leverage each other to become greater than the sum of this whole? I mean, and I don't know exactly how we do that, but I feel that with change happening at the CARICOM Secretariat level right now, I feel that now is the time for them to take a look at their priorities, at their structure, at their processes, and see how they can build some of these kind of more modern ways of looking at regional integration into the work that they do. For example, I would love the CARICOM Secretariat to now have a serious approach looking at regional SDG investment, for that to be part of their business line, where they bring together stakeholders from across the region, not just policymakers and not just chambers of commerce, but true stakeholder engagement to discuss these things. Because one thing that we were talking about earlier is the fact that foreign policy in small island developing states, domestic policy and investment policy, they're all the same thing. We are far too small to have demarcation of policies. Foreign policy and investment policy have got to drive and support our domestic priorities. So I think that there's still so much more that we need to do kind of behind the border in terms of backward linkages of really making sure that all of these approaches sing from the same hymn sheet and that they're mutually supportive. Now, one thing I also wanted to point out, because although we're getting a lot of comments on the chat, I'm also getting some really good comments on my WhatsApp from people who are there. And one thing that somebody raised with me, and I think is really important, just to go back to the SDGs, is does our business community in the Caribbean really understand what the SDGs are? And I'm not talking about having the wonderful kind of posters showing all the different colors, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, do they understand the business case for the SDGs? Do they understand that by going green and by moving into a greener way of producing, a leaner way of producing that reflects SDG 13 or SDG 17, that this actually brings profitable benefits to their business? Have we been able to really show that in a granular way? So I think that this is something that I think we should maybe think about a little bit more. Maybe ITC, maybe the UN resident coordinator, maybe the SRC, maybe Caribbean Export. Maybe we need to put ourselves together and think, have we really been helping the private sector in the Caribbean to understand the realistic implications and benefits of taking the SDGs seriously? Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, James, go ahead.
The private sector, but also the banking industry specifically, how many people in the banking industry know the acronym SDGs that even exists? Similarly, in the finance sector, globally, ESG is a term, somewhat parallel. Environment, social governance is a term that's used a lot, but is rarely used in the Caribbean. And I think that there are a couple of banks. The Republic Bank is one example that is actually embracing the SDGs and has specific policies around the SDGs, but the vast majority of the banks in the region are just not really aware of those terms and are not really using them, unfortunately. And I think that if there is an opportunity, we all know that it's much harder to get finance in the Caribbean than it is in other regions. If that can be solved and that can also be linked somehow to SDGs, then that could be a really interesting opportunity for businesses and a reason for businesses themselves to adopt them.
Thank you so much, James. I mean, there's so many interesting points to unpack here, but the access to finance one is a really important one. And just to roll everything together, the regional point, the access to finance, the SDG knowledge among the private sector point, one of the things that persons often speak about is the fact that it is so difficult to get financing in the region, and maybe having something like a regional stock exchange would be useful, right? So there is, of course, some way in which having a greater Caribbean policy framework, whether it's in terms of, maybe ways in which we attract investment or what have you, it would be useful to have that sort of framework, that sort of regional approach to investment. And there have been so many good comments here, but I just wanted to mention one of the comments which spoke about the time it takes to invest. The fact that these decisions tend to be time sensitive, right? So there was a question for you, Matthew, in the Q&A. Okay. Okay, this was answered. I think it was answered. Okay, so there was another question with regard to, hold on a minute. Let me scroll up. Right, forgive me, the questions are coming in so fast and furious. But now that we are on the whole issue of access to financing and the whole issue of raising awareness among the banks, how do we go about doing this? Is that the role of the government? Is that the role of the banking sector itself? The banking associations in the different territories? Who's responsible for raising awareness on these things?
I'm a big believer in showing that something works and then people follow. So I'm reading through the chat and I'm seeing, I don't know if it was Ralph or someone that said that their company has just recently attracted this 3 million equity investment, et cetera, which is great. Now, how did you do it? Are you willing to share how you did it? Are you willing to share your model? Are you willing to share lessons learned? So I think these sorts of things are really important as well. So even that use of that term rival private sector, when it comes to things like going green, when it comes to things like climate change adaptation, I don't think it should be an issue of rivalry. I mean, you're looking at the economic livelihood of your small economy. So I really would like us to be able to share a bit more of successful experiences. So, I mean, for example, I know in ITC has been working with Barclays Bank, for example, in Kenya, many years ago. They opened a specific arm for women-owned enterprises to be able to borrow money for small projects. I think it was maybe a $500 million arm, maybe a $50 million arm. And after 1 year, no one had tapped into those resources. Why did they not tap into those resources? Because they were not able to really put forward bankable projects, which is a huge problem across the developing world, where we're not able, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, to develop bankable projects for financing or for investment. So that's one thing I think we need to do. And I know ITC did work with the women-owned enterprises and the banks to help them build these bankable projects. And then we just saw the money kind of, go out through the door, because the offer was there and the request was there and the two of them were able to meet. So I think we need to do a bit more work on this as well. And I'm happy that the CDB is actually starting a project where they're helping the private sector to be able to develop financing requirements and bankable projects that they would be able to actually access finance and investment. So I think this is really important. But we just need to kind of have proof of what's the word I'm looking for? Proof that it works, and to showcase that and to see what the models are, the ingredients were to have made that successful. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And a quick question. So we've spoken about the domestic private sector, we've spoken about the foreign private sector in terms of FDI. What about the role of the diaspora? Is there a role for the diaspora in terms of like information sharing and helping to address some of these things that we've spoken about? Anyone?
I'm probably the least qualified person on this panel to talk about the diaspora, but I have a quick comment on that I think there's a really interesting opportunity for governments to keep diaspora more engaged now, as the sense of belonging to a country is changing more and more with how particularly younger people are engaging the internet and engaging with their home communities or communities of origin. So I do think that is important, and the fact that there are these approaches by a number of governments to formally engage the diaspora. One project that we have been recently exploring with a Caribbean business is looking at equity crowdfunding, which is essentially new regulations that have been brought in the US to allow US companies to take minimum $100 investments before they go public. And so potentially raising millions of dollars by small investments from a large number of people. This is possible for a Caribbean business if they go through US mechanisms currently. I don't know of any Caribbean countries that have mechanisms available to do that. But I am particularly excited about how the diaspora could be leveraged in these situations. And many of the businesses that are most successful in these kind of equity crowdfunding projects are in areas like areas that are related to the sustainable development goals. So it could be a really interesting area to explore. I will say when people hear crowdfunding, they often think of saving or kind of charity projects, but this is actually really crowd investing in a company and hopefully seeing a return on that in the future, which could really help build wealth in the region.
And that's an excellent point, James. And it also raises the whole issue in terms of the lack of diversity of ways in which you could raise financing in the region. So I saw an article by, but featuring Dr. Cleaveston Haynes, who's the central bank governor, and he was speaking about the large amount of domestic savings in our banking system. And the fact is that a lot of people will rather put their money, see it right now as more beneficial, and I don't mean just individuals, but also businesses. Some businesses see it better to put their money in the banks because there are not that many financing options, many options out there to get a return on your investment. So are there any innovative from your, both you and Matthew, from your vantage point, are there any other interesting financing options that you see in some of the countries that you've worked with that might be useful models for the region?
It's a really ticklish situation. I mean, this is the problem when you're dealing with very small economies. Then you really do have a very kind of narrow set of options for investments, but I've been seeing certain things recently, like in Seychelles, I think it was, they've kind of launched this new kind of, is it like a green bond, I believe, and I think Kenya is also a country that's also very interested in this. So it would be really great for us to explore options like that, because there are a number of sustainability funds that are now coming on the horizon. The majority of them, unfortunately, in developed countries for developed countries. But yet again, I think that these are models that we can kind of take on board. And they focus on things like clean energy, clean technology, on sustainable agriculture and food security. And these are all things which are incredibly interesting and important to us in the Caribbean. So it'd be really good to see how we can look at that. Another thing that I think would be really important for us to look at is how we can use the existing private sector companies, the large private sector companies in the Caribbean. And I hear what you say, Alicia, that in many respects, they would be considered SMEs on the global scale, but in the Caribbean, they're fairly large. So, I mean, when I'm looking at companies like Goddard's and Massey and Digicel and Rubisco and FedEx and Sandals, I really feel, and I kind of hope that some of them are on the line, I really feel that there's more that they can do. I really feel that there's more that they can do to kind of exploit in a positive way the SDGs. open an SDG investment arm, for example, merge it with your corporate social responsibility approach. And I'm not talking about giving hampers. I'm not talking about, giving small educational scholarships. I mean, I'm talking about really utilizing the notion of investment in the country that you are operating in. And I feel policy also has an important part to play here. Why not mandate that if you're going to want to invest in our countries, that you do have very specific SDG indicators and markers, so that we know that you're going to be investing in these areas. We know that we can monitor what you're able to do. So these are some actions I think that the policymakers, the government, CARICOM at the regional level could take as well, to say, listen, we welcome you to come and invest in our country, but if you do, we would like you to focus on SDG 5 or women's economic empowerment, or SDG 13 or SDG 2, so that we have a very clear understanding of where you will also be investing some of your CRS money or whatnot. So I think that kind of thing is really important, especially when it comes to things like, building greener and more climate smart processes. I think that a lot of these companies really do have examples of where they've been able to do this in other regions in the world, and they can bring these models to the Caribbean as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm cognizant that we only have 9 more minutes as we're going to 11:30. So panelists, at this juncture, I think it would be good for us to just get some parting thoughts from each of you. I'll start with Jason.
Thank you, Alicia. Well, I think for me, and it has been reiterated in the course of the discussions that we're having today, that the ease of doing business in the region needs to improve considerably. We've long passed a time when manual processes, manual systems were the order of the day. We need to now move in the direction of embracing ICT. It is here to stay, and we need to recognize it as such. We need also to move in the direction of introducing commercial courts, if they don't already exist in our jurisdictions, such that the backlog, which has characterized many of our countries, can be appropriately dealt with, and then investors invariably can have an ease of confidence, knowing that if they were to litigate a matter before courts, that it wouldn't take an inordinate amount of time to be finally resolved. We need to embrace alternative dispute resolution systems, set up ADR centers, enhance their structures and processes to make them transparent and attractive, such that in the event that disputes arise, parties can negotiate their way out of those disputes and maintain, of course, amicable relationships in so doing. We also need to, as has been repeatedly stated here, deal with what is a recurrent challenge, the fact that culturally we seem to be okay with the liturgy regarding foreign direct investment, how we treat investors, how we respond to investors. I think that really needs to be dealt with as a cultural shift. I think more efforts need to be in the direction of ensuring and information are available, that laws that govern investments are appropriately placed on access sources, websites, and that invariably, if we can get all of these laws in one bundle, so that investors can access them quite easily, that will be quite useful as well. And I think overall, we need to really sit down and have a serious conversation, not just a policy conversation, but a broad-based conversation that involves all economic and social actors about the value of foreign direct investment, what it means to us, and how we can attract investments. And perhaps it might very well start with a policy on foreign direct investment. Of course, 1 or 2 countries in the region have policies, but it's not ubiquitous across the region. And I think that if we move in that direction, it may well create more investor confidence. And one other thing, investors invariably are very risk averse. And so any indication that there may be corruption related practices, They may very well be anti-competitive business practices, abuse of dominant position. They're not taken very lightly by investors. So we need to do a lot more in terms of promoting our islands as having a landscape that is transparent, that is not encumbered by practices of corruption, that involves fair competition policies and practices as well. I think those would work well to advance our goals and interests as small island developing states.
Thank you so much. Lots of policy-oriented and action-oriented suggestions there, which is part of what this discussion is about. Thank you so much, Jason. I'll move on now to James.
Thank you all. I think this was quite a wide-ranging discussion, and I think the points that I wanted to underline is the diversity of the private sector and the diversity of the SDGs. And clearly today, what we've discussed that maybe affects some of those does not always affect all of them. I think that there is really an important place for the SDGs in island nations and in SIDS countries. Personally, I think that government has to be involved in some level, just because government plays such a large role in the economy. And I saw some interesting comments in the chat about how governments can play that role. But I really see that as whether it's local, national, or regional governments, they can really be if they set the playing field right, they should be able to be the ones that unlock the potential of the private sector. And unfortunately, what we see too much now is that governments get in the way of the private sector and stop things happening. So I think that mind shift, that mindset shift and shift in terms of how these different sectors relate to each other is really important, because they all have a role. Yeah, really happy to be part of this discussion. Thanks again to the host and the other panelists, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, James. And Matthew, parting shots.
Yeah, just 5 parting shots. Number 1, governments hold investors to account a bit more to invest in the SDGs. Number 1. Number 2, I think we should really look at whether or not we need to practically educate or inform our private sector about the benefits and the opportunities of the SDGs, breaking that down in real business terms. Number 3, I really feel that the existing private sector actors in the region can possibly do a bit more in terms of investing in the SDGs. For example, I would love to explore with Digicel or Flow how we can improve the digital footprint of small businesses in the region, give them greater access, greater connectivity, or to work with Sandoz or Marriott or some of the cruise liners on how to better source from SMEs in the region, or with Massy or with Bisco on how we can help SMEs to better brand and market made in Caribbean brands. I mean, these are all economic activities which contribute to the SDGs. And then on SMEs, I really would like to see us include them a bit more as active contributors in reducing the region's massive food import bill. I mean, this is something really, really serious I think we need to think about. I want to see more local produce in the hotels and the restaurants. And this means working with the SMEs on quality, on making sure that they can be sourced appropriately, on meeting quality standards, and that they're consistent and offer competitive prices. So in essence, at the regional level, I think we need to kind of realign the public policies to support smallholder sustainable food economies, and that's a huge part of the SDG mandate as well. I understand CARICOM is finalizing this Advancing CARICOM Agri-Food Systems Agenda, which aims to reduce the import bill and strengthen food security. And I really hope that they're including SMEs and other stakeholders and BSOs and TISIs and IPAs in that discussion as well. And then finally, I think we really need to seriously take another look at the regional approach. The last time we discussed it, I mentioned this whole idea of the Chaguaramas Treaty 2.0. Or maybe it was 3.0, I don't know, but I still think we need to really invest in CARICOM at the regional level to be able to take on some of these responsibilities for us and really give it a truly regional lens. So really having a track within the CARICOM Secretariat, within the process that looks at private sector investment in the SDGs, I think would be really critical. Thanks.
And thank you so much, Matthew. So at this time, it just falls on me as moderator to thank everyone. First of all, our esteemed panelists, you're all very busy people, but you took the time to come and share your vast expertise and your experience and your ideas and some concrete solutions that the region could consider. As we all know, this is a all of society all the society approach is required. So that's one of the reasons why we at the SRC see these sorts of conversations as important outputs for us in order to make sure that we are doing the sort of research, doing the sort of outreach that is important, not just for industry, but also for society at large. I want to thank Professor Sachs, who's no longer here, of course, for taking the time, the excellent SRC team, especially my director, Dr. Remy. I also like to thank you in the audience for sharing all of your wonderful comments, your questions. I wasn't able to get to all of them, but this will not be the first nor the last of these sorts of discussions. So thank you so much for staying with us, and please do follow us on social media at UESRC. And also follow our website, shridath.ramphal.center.com, and our newsletter. Thank you so much, and wishing everyone a pleasant remainder of your day.